Chapter 1, Crash Landing. Greg had been flying through the dark night sky for what felt like an eternity. Each passing second pushing him closer and closer to his destination. He had been searching for a new home, a safe place to land and call his own. Finally, after a long and tedious journey, he saw it. A small, vibrant planet in the far reaches of the universe. He had found his home. He was finally here. Greg began to descend, his ship slowly gliding towards the planet's surface. But his joy soon turned to terror as he realized the planet was not as welcoming as he had expected. The sky was filled with thick smoke, and the ground was littered with debris from a recent battle. Suddenly, a bright light appeared in the distance, quickly growing brighter and brighter. Greg realized it was a missile, headed straight for him. He quickly pulled up and tried to avoid it. But it was too late, the missile had found its target. The crash was deafening, and the force of the impact sent Greg spiraling towards the planet. He was now at the mercy of the planet's gravitational pull, and his fate was unknown. Greg closed his eyes, bracing himself for the worst. But then, it happened, he felt a gentle force pull him back up, as if the planet was welcoming him with open arms. He had survived. The planet had become his home. Chapter 2, Adapting. Greg had crash landed on Earth and he was scared. He didn't know what to expect and he was desperate to remain hidden. The alien had to find a way to blend in and survive in this strange new world. The first thing he had to do was to learn the local customs. He watched from afar as people interacted and he tried to mimic their behavior. But he was often met with confusion and suspicion. He knew he had to do more if he wanted to fit in. So he took a risk and decided to try to make friends, even though he was afraid of being discovered. He made contact with an elderly couple at a local park, and they were intrigued by his strange behavior. After a few awkward conversations, the couple eventually accepted Greg and even invited him to their home for dinner. Greg was surprised at how willing they were to welcome him. He proceeded to stay with the couple for a few days, learning more and more about this strange new world. He was amazed at the kindness and hospitality this couple had shown. Still, Greg was cautious. He was always aware of the fact that he was an alien, and he didn't want to endanger his new friends. He kept his identity a secret, which made the couple more curious about him. Sometimes, Greg would venture out into the city, exploring what this new world had to offer. He was fascinated by the technology and the way people interacted with each other. He was slowly beginning to adapt to his new life on Earth. But no matter how much he tried to fit in, Greg was still an alien. He had to constantly be aware of his surroundings and remain careful. He had no idea what would happen if he was discovered. That fear pushed him to continue to learn, explore, and adapt. Chapter 3, Desperation. Greg had been on Earth for weeks, but he still hadn't figured out how to feed himself. With no money and no job, he had to resort to scavenging for food in the streets. The food he found was barely enough to survive, and he was slowly becoming weaker. He had to find a way to get more food, and fast. One day, Greg decided to take a risk and visit a local bar. He knew it was dangerous, but he was desperate. When he arrived, he saw that the bar was full of people. He nervously made his way in, trying not to draw attention to himself. As he walked through the bar, he was relieved to see that nobody seemed to notice him. He was just about to turn around and leave, when he heard someone shouting at him. It was the bartender. He had noticed Greg and demanded to know what he was doing there. Greg was shocked and tried to explain that he was just looking for food. But the bartender was having none of it. He said that Greg was trespassing and threatened to call the police. Greg was scared and tried to reason with the bartender. But the man was adamant. He was about to call the police when a tall, muscular man stepped in. The man introduced himself as John, and said he was a regular at the bar. He offered to pay for Greg's meal and said he could stay as long as he liked. The bartender reluctantly agreed and let Greg stay. Greg thanked John for his kindness, and the two of them began to talk. John told Greg about his life and how he had come to be in the bar. He said he was a former soldier and had seen a lot of violence in his time. He said he wanted to help people like Greg, who were struggling to find food and a place to stay. Greg was touched by John's story and felt a newfound respect for him. He thanked John again and said that he would never forget his kindness. He promised to repay him one day, when he was back on his feet. John smiled and said there was no need to repay him. He said that helping people was what he lived for, and that he was glad to have been of service. Greg left the bar with a full stomach and a newfound respect for the people of Earth. He also left with a new friend in John, and promised himself he would never forget his kind gesture. Chapter 4: A Place to Call Home. Greg had been staying with John for a few days, and he was glad for the company and the shelter. It was a welcome reprieve from the fear and desperation he had been feeling. John was also a great listener and Greg felt comfortable talking to him. One night, John asked Greg if he needed anything. Greg hesitated, unsure of what he was supposed to say. He was taken aback when John suggested he could help him find a job and a place to live. Greg was speechless and couldn't believe his luck. After a few moments of silence, he finally found the courage to accept the offer. The next day, John and Greg set off to find a job. After a few hours of walking around, they finally found a small cafe that was looking for help. Greg nervously applied and was accepted on the spot. After a few weeks of hard work, the cafe owner trusted him enough to offer him a room in the back of the cafe. Greg was elated and couldn't believe his luck. He had finally found a place to call home. He thanked John for all his help and support, and promised to stay in touch. Greg still had a long way to go in his journey on Earth, but he was now one step closer to finding a home. He was determined to make the most of this opportunity, and to make the people of Earth proud. Chapter 5: In Search of Refuge. Greg had finally settled into his new life on Earth, working day and night at the cafe, and learning more about the people around him. He was beginning to feel more at ease, and was starting to build a routine he could rely on. One day, he was in the middle of his shift, when a group of unfamiliar men entered the cafe. The men were wearing all black, and none of them had their faces visible. They seemed to be looking for something, but none of them said a word. Greg watched as the men went from table to table, examining the customers but not speaking a single word. Greg was starting to grow more and more anxious as the men lingered in the cafe. Then, he noticed one of them staring at him. His heart raced as he thought of the possibilities of being discovered, and he knew he had to get out of there. He ran out of the cafe, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran as fast as he could, quickly ducking into a nearby forested area for cover. Greg had escaped. He was still shaking from the sudden surge of adrenaline, and trying to catch his breath. Greg decided he must confide in John for help. He needed a place to hide. Greg made his way through the forest until he reached a paved road. He didn't recognize this area of town. He started walking towards a light emanating from a nearby building, and as he got closer he realized what it was. It was a gas station. He quickly found a phone and called John. After a short conversation, John was able to find out where Greg was, and came to his aid. Chapter 6: Unveiling Verity. John had been worried about Greg ever since the mysterious men had showed up. He had been asking questions, but Greg had been evasive and refused to tell him the whole truth. One night, at John's house, Greg knew he had to come clean. He took a deep breath, and began to tell John his story. Greg explained that he had been a refugee from a distant planet, and that he had been searching for a new home when he had come across Earth. He told John about the battle he had seen, and how he had crashed on the planet. He had been lucky to survive, but knew he had to remain hidden if he was to stay alive. He had been terrified of being discovered, and that was why he had been so hesitant to tell John his story. John listened intently, unable to believe what he was hearing. He was stunned, but he could tell that Greg was telling the truth. He decided to trust his new friend, and offered his help in any way he could. Greg was touched by John's offer, and knew that he could no longer stay hidden. He needed to tell someone he could trust, and he was glad that he had chosen John. He thanked John for his understanding and trust, and felt relieved to have someone who he could rely on. John made sure that Greg was safe and comfortable. He asked if there was anything else he could do, and Greg gave him a grateful smile. He asked John to join him in his mission to find a new home and a new life, and John agreed without hesitation. The two of them talked and planned late into the night, and the next morning they set off on their journey. John was determined to help Greg find a new home, and Greg was determined to never give up hope. The two of them had an unbreakable bond and an unwavering determination. They were going to find a way to make Greg's dreams come true, and they were going to do it together. Chapter 7, Alien Pursuit. John and Greg had been on the road for the past few weeks, and had managed to stay under the radar. They had been avoiding the main roads, and had been relying on John's past military experience to stay hidden. But it seemed that their luck was about to run out. One morning, as the two men stopped for breakfast in a small roadside diner, John noticed a group of men sitting in the corner. They were all wearing black, and seemed to be deep in conversation. John was suspicious, and his instincts told him that they may be a threat. He decided to keep an eye on them while they ate. And as Greg and John left the diner, John noticed the men suddenly spring into action. One of the men was on the phone, speaking urgently and gesturing wildly, while the other four raced towards a vehicle parked nearby. John knew that they were coming for him and Greg. Without a word, the two men raced out of the diner and jumped into John's car. As they sped away, they could see the men chasing after them. John and Greg drove as fast as they could, taking turns along the winding roads. They managed to lose the men, but not before Greg had recognized their pursuers. The men were aliens, just like him. After realizing the danger they were in, John and Greg decided to lay low for the time being. They found a remote and safe spot to camp out and rest. But they knew they had to be careful and remain vigilant. The men had been tracking Greg. They had tracked him along the way from his home planet, and were determined to find him and take him back. John and Greg had no idea who had sent them, and why they were after Greg. But they knew that they had to be prepared for anything. Over the next few days, they devised a plan to keep safe and avoid detection. They began to disguise themselves, and change their route frequently. And they made sure to stay away from any populated areas. They knew that they were in a race against time to find a safe place to hide, and they had to stay one step ahead of their pursuers if they were to make it. They had to be smart, and they had to be brave. Chapter 8, Hostile Havoc. John and Greg had been on the run for weeks. They knew they had to find a place to stay, but they also knew it had to be something they could afford. They decided to stop at a motel on the edge of town, hoping they would be able to blend in and remain unnoticed. The motel was run down and unimpressive, but it was the best they could do. John and Greg checked in, and were taken to their room. It was small and cramped, but it was safe. John and Greg were glad to have a place to rest and regroup. And they quickly realized that it was the safest place for them. The two men had just begun to settle in, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. The two men froze, afraid of what may lay beyond. John cautiously opened the door, and to his horror, he was faced with the same aliens who had been tracking them for weeks. The aliens had finally caught up to them, and they had nowhere to hide. The aliens forced their way into the room, and before John and Greg could react, they were thrown to the ground. The aliens quickly started searching the room. John and Greg had no idea what they were looking for. Finally, the aliens discovered what they wanted. They had been searching for Greg. The aliens dragged Greg away, leaving behind a terrified John who could do nothing but watch in fear. John was in shock. He had no idea what the aliens wanted with Greg, and he had no idea where they had taken him. John was worried and scared, but he had to stay strong. He knew he had to find a way to save his friend. John packed a few of his belongings and left the motel, determined to find Greg and bring him back. He knew that it would be a difficult journey, and he wasn't sure what he would find. But he was sure of one thing: he would not leave Greg to the mercy of the aliens. He had to save him. John was ready to do whatever it took. Chapter 9, Brainwashed. John drove for hours, determined to reach Greg in time. He eventually made his way to a large, isolated compound. As he approached, he noticed a group of men wearing black, and quickly realized he had found the aliens' hideout. John carefully surveyed the area, searching for a way in. He heard voices coming from a nearby building, and he realized that this must be where Greg was being held. He cautiously crept closer, until he was able to get a glimpse inside. Inside, he saw Greg sitting in a chair, surrounded by the aliens, who were talking and pointing in his direction. John was relieved to see Greg alive, but soon noticed something odd. Greg seemed calm and relaxed, not at all like the frightened person John had been expecting. He was almost certain Greg had been brainwashed, and he feared it was too late to help him. John was about to leave when Greg looked up and noticed him from the window. Greg waved and smiled, beckoning John to come closer. John was shocked and confused. He couldn't understand why Greg seemed so relaxed and unafraid. He cautiously approached the building, and when he was close enough, Greg gestured for him to come inside. John stepped through the door, and to his surprise, Greg greeted him warmly. The aliens paid no attention to John and Greg, and instead continued to discuss their plans. Greg whispered to John that he was not in any danger, and that he had been allowed to stay in the compound at the aliens' request. He said he only wanted to talk with John and explain everything. John was stunned. He had never expected this turn of events, but he knew that he needed to stay with Greg and hear his story. He agreed to stay and listen, and Greg promised him that he would learn the truth soon enough. Chapter 10, A Valiant Savior. John and Greg sat in the stark, windowless room, the walls echoing their hushed voices. As Greg began to explain, he revealed that the aliens were not an invading force, but a desperate search party from his home planet. His own family had sent out the mission in search of him. Greg was from a small planet that was dying from within. His kind were in desperate need of a savior. He had been born with a rare power, one that could have revolutionized the planet, but was also one that scared his people. Deciding that it was better to leave before his power could be discovered, Greg had set off in search of a new home. As his story unfolded, so did the truth of why his family had sent out the search party. The truth of the situation was that Greg had an incredible gift. He possessed an ancient, powerful magic that his people had long forgotten existed. His family had sent out the search party in hopes of finding him, to use his magic to save their planet. The planet was being threatened by an unknown force, and the only way to stop it was to use the ancient magic. It was the only hope of survival for the planet and its inhabitants. Greg looked at John and sighed. He could never ask John to come with him and risk his own life in order to save a planet he had no connection to. Greg had grown to love Earth and its people, and he had a home here. But he knew he had to go back and try to save his planet. John held his friend tightly and made a promise that he would always keep Greg in his heart. Greg thanked him for all of his help and understanding, and looked out into the night sky. He began to reminisce about his home planet and all the memories he had there. He said a silent goodbye and made a promise to himself to return one day and see the world he had left behind in a better state. As the sun began to rise, Greg bid his farewells and vanished into the sky. John watched as Greg's ship soared higher and higher until it disappeared into the clouds. A sense of peace washed over him as he realized that he could take solace in the fact that he had helped give Greg the chance to save his home and make a difference in the world. In that moment, John knew that the bond between the two of them was unbreakable. He was sure that no matter what happened, they would always find a way to stay connected.